Chapter 14, How Biological Diversity Evolves. So we'll continue some of the concepts we saw in Chapter 13 in this chapter, and there'll be a little bit of repetition. So looking at the origin of species, in the 150 years since Darwin's on the origin of species by means of natural selection, new discoveries and technological advances have given scientists just tons and tons of information about the evolution of life on Earth. So the diversity of life evolved through a process called speciation, the development, the process through which through which a species, an original parental species, splits into one or more, sometimes they're called daughter species. So we've talked about Darwin's finches, the one parental species, a small group of finches most likely, arrived on the islands. In that one population of finches initially was one species, and over time that one species split, notice the little division here, split into two species, and then later on into 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's like 14 species currently alive on the islands. So where you see this branching event here on this tree of life, which is also called a phylogeny, we refer to that as a speciation event or macroevolutionary event. Okay, remember microevolutionary changes were changes at the genetic level, and those have to occur before speciation occurs or macroevolution occurs. So speciation is the same as macroevolution. All right, so notice here a branching event, speciation occurs. The parental species is no longer around. It broke into one, and then later 2 and 3 species, in this case of flies. So we've been talking about species. So what is a species? So one basic definition is the biological species concept. And what this definition, how it defines a species is the species is a group of population whose members have potential to interbreed with one another and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so a group of organisms, a population, where they can potentially interbreed, doesn't mean they have to. They have the ability to interbreed, mate, and have fertile offspring, meaning their offspring, the babies, can grow up and they would be fertile themselves and would be able to reproduce. Okay? So for example, there are some really close similarities between species, and unless you're a bird expert, you would not be able to differentiate between these two birds, which are members of different species. And they're different species because they either do not interbreed, or if they do interbreed, they do not produce living, viable, fertile offspring. Okay, so this is a common species definition, the biological species concept. So this definition, however, can't be applied in all situations because not all organisms reproduce sexually. Many organisms reproduce asexually, like all of the bacteria and archaea, many of the protists. And for example, if they're trying to identify fossil species, well, those things are clearly dead. They are not reproducing, so there has to be other ways to identify and label a species, and there are. So other ways to be able to define a species is through some physical traits, things that you can measure, and this applies to fossils because, if you have fossilized remains, bones, etc., you can clearly measure them and use that to define a species. Or using genetics, molecular data, molecular analysis, the genetic analysis of, say, bacteria, which is becoming more and more common in the sense of utilizing genetics to identify species. So reproductive barriers between species. So there's a number of mechanisms that prevent organisms from populations from successfully interbreeding. So these are called reproductive barriers, right? Anything that prevents individuals of closely related species from interbreeding. And our figure here shows individuals of different species, color-coded, an individual in red, one in yellow. If they cannot mate, and if those reproductive barriers prevent mating, those are called prezygotic barriers. In other words, mating barriers that occur before the fertilization of the egg, because a zygote, if you remember, is a fertilized egg. Okay? And even if there is a mating attempt, there are still some prezygotic barriers that prevent the egg and the sperm from fusing. All right? If there are reproductive barriers that occur after the zygote forms, then those are called postzygotic barriers, and there are a few of those that exist. And there are even these exist to prevent the generation of fertile offspring after the zygote's been produced. Okay? So there are prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. If none of these barriers are in existence, then the organisms can mate, the gametes can fuse, and then the offspring are produced. And if the offspring are viable, meaning healthy, living, if they're fertile, meaning when they become adults they can sexually reproduce with other members of their species, then there are no barriers to sexual reproduction, or there are no reproductive barriers, for example, between humans. Okay? In terms of biological reproductive barriers. Okay, so again, the prezygotic barriers prevent mating or fertilization between species, no fusion of the egg and sperm, or no mating, no intercourse, no sex. So prezygotic barriers, there's something called temporal isolation. So closely related groups that could potentially interbreed are prevented from interbreeding because of the temporal isolation between their breeding cycles. For example, the females in one population might become receptive for mating, which is at a different time than another group of organisms. So this occurs with numerous separate species in nature that could potentially interbreed, but they don't because there's a temporal barrier between when they would normally be able to mate. Okay, so a time barrier in a way. All right, habitat isolation. The members of the two populations of closely related species simply live in different habitats, so they don't really come into close enough contact for long enough to be able to successfully reproduce. Behavioral isolation. Many species have certain behavioral mating rituals that must be successfully accomplished before they would mate. So that's somewhat of an advanced reproductive barrier, behavioral isolation. Okay, like bird songs, right? Birds sing, often males, to attract the females. The females, if they don't recognize or are receptive to that behavior, then they simply won't mate. And that is common between closely related different species. Mechanical isolation. This is where physical structures prevent mating. The example here, there's two closely related members, snail members of different species, and they're different species because their physical reproductive anatomy doesn't match each other. In this case, because they're literally on the different sides of their bodies, and they cannot successfully mate, even if they might be interested in mating. Right? So those are mechanical barriers. And then gametic isolation. Very closely related groups, different species. The gametes, they may produce gametes that simply do not mate with each other, and usually it's because they don't have a correct genetic similarity. There's enough genetic dissimilarities that would prevent the gametes from fusing with each other. Okay, and this can occur with so sea urchins are release their gametes, sperm and eggs into the water, and they come into contact with each other, but they don't fertilize each other. So there's gametic isolation. There might be an example where there's two closely related species where they actually might have intercourse, sex, and sperm is introduced into the female, placed into the female. So they have sex, they mate, but the gametes still will not fuse with each other to form a zygote. Okay, so that's all of these are pre-zygotic barriers. Reproductive barriers that prevent the zygote from forming, even if the zygotes come into contact with each other. So temporal isolation, skunk species that mate at different times, well, they will not then be able to mate with each other. Garter snake species from different habitats don't come into contact with each other. Mating rituals of blue-footed boobies, but there's many examples in nature of mating rituals that will prevent reproduction. Mechanical isolation, snail species whose genital openings do not align, don't match up. Gametic isolation, sea urchin species whose gametes simply cannot fuse, even if they come into contact with each other. Okay, all pre-zygotic reproductive barriers. This albatross courtship video, there's no sound, but it just shows you that with albatrosses, notice this elaborate behavior, and that has to occur before they can reproduce. So if, let's say, theoretically, there's two closely related albatross species, but they're not the same species, this courtship ritual between a male and a female would not be successful because they are not closely enough. They're not related closely enough. Okay, so an example of a pre-zygotic reproductive barrier. Blue-footed boobies courtship rituals. Oh, okay, just another example of a bird species who has an elaborate courtship ritual. And we've talked about this before. Similar to the albatross courtship ritual. And again, this is common in birds, other species as well, but they have to have this nice elaborate courtship ritual between male and female before the male and the female can mate. Okay, just another example of a pre-zygotic reproductive barrier. Giraffes, they themselves have a courtship ritual. And then notice how they actually use their long necks to have their courtship ritual. And if you remember, we talked about how sexual selection, a type of natural selection, is one of the hypotheses for why the long neck developed in giraffes. That was in one of our previous chapters. Okay, post-zygotic barriers will be the next thing we'll talk about. So moving on to post-zygotic barriers. I can do this. Post-zygotic barriers. These are barriers that prevent closely related species from forming fertile, viable offspring after the zygote gets formed. So the members of the different species, closely related, would actually mate. The sperm and eggs would fuse, so there's fertilization, but then there's barriers that prevent that zygote from being born and growing up to be fertile itself. So post-zygotic barriers operate if interspecies mating occurs, meaning species mating between different species. Interspecies is between different species. And a hybrid zygote forms. So a hybrid is a combination of gametes with different genetic information. Come on, cursor. Here we go. Okay, so examples. Post-zygotic barriers. Reduced hybrid viability, meaning the hybrid can actually be born, but it has a reduced survivability. Right? It's not going to live long enough to reproduce. Reduced hybrid fertility. A horse and a donkey can actually mate and reproduce and have a baby that grows up, have a relatively long lifespan. A mule, perfectly healthy animal. However, mules are infertile. They cannot produce zygotes. So that tells biologists A horse and a donkey are